What's up YouTube? In today's video, we're going to be talking about China's massive meltdown that's potentially going to happen in the next few months. As we've all seen, the stock market has been going down, real estate prices have been going down, mortgage rates have been increasing, but that's here in the United States. Over in China, things are much worse. In this video by Business Basics, we're going to be seeing China's mortgage crisis, how banks are failing, how there's protests everywhere, and how China's financial crisis is here. So without further ado, let's hop on in.
In 1989, the CCP did something that shocked the entire world.
Yeah, this is wild. And the crazy thing is they actually censored this stuff in China for the longest time. So you cannot find images of this Tiananmen Square massacre anywhere if you were in China.
China's democracy protests were threatening the CCP's rule. It made them scared. So scared that the CCP decided to launch an attack against its own citizens to silence the protests. In the process, thousands of innocent Chinese students were
Wow, I didn't know it was 10,000 people. That's pretty wild.
killed, and thousands more were wounded. In the last few weeks, something similar has been happening in China that is scaring the CCP.
On July 14th, over 1,000 victimized owners of rotten tile buildings, unfinished projects in Xi'an, China, surrounded by Shaanxi Building and Insurance Regulatory Commission protest. So in the past few years, a lot of properties were being created, right? Like a lot of real estate was being developed in the hopes that they would sell the properties off and then use those funds to build new developments, etc., etc. But over the past few years, people were just not moving into the buildings. I guess properties weren't being completed. And then you also have some buildings that were completed, but people weren't moving in. So you just have a bunch of vacant buildings in there. And because these projects were unfinished, or there's only half the people moving into them, the developers just didn't maintain them very well. So these properties aren't doing very well.
Chinese citizens across the country took to social media to do something that has never been done before. Thousands of would-be homeowners pushed for a movement to stop paying mortgages on their homes in an attempt to put pressure on the CCP and banks to treat them fairly. Protests broke out in multiple cities, and the crusade seems to be gaining more and more momentum each day. The CCP is so worried that it has already sent out tanks to maintain stability.
Yo, this is sus.
For the first time in more than 30 years, the CCP is fearing for its existence, and it all has to do with China's real estate bubble. According to one expert, the CCP sees this situation as a political protest, not a banking crisis. Government officials are extremely fearful about how this might turn out.
But one country could already be facing a recession, and that is China.
A massive protest over frozen bank deposits.
Hundreds gathered in Zhengzhou.
Big Chinese banks are at risk. Over $9 trillion in loans are at danger of defaults, and if the situation gets any worse, this could foretell the collapse of China and the CCP. This mortgage crisis isn't the only crisis the CCP is dealing with. Zero COVID policies and bank deposit scams in Henan pose a big risk to China's fragile economy too. But this mortgage situation is by far the biggest threat, as it affects trillions of dollars, involves some of the most important industries like banking and real estate, and influences millions of households in the country. According to a well-respected expert, this mortgage crisis could be 100 times worse than the 2008 financial crisis. Here in Uncle Sam's America, it's considered to be an important part of the American dream to own a home. But slowly, it's getting less popular among newer generations to do so because, well, it's not very affordable. China, on the other hand, is different. The importance of owning a house has only gone up in the past couple of decades. Real estate is one of the asset classes that the public trusts more than anything.
There's a lot of Chinese investors that actually buy properties here in the United States, and they buy it with cash, and then they leave the properties vacant for many years. They do this because they don't trust the Chinese government's economy, and they don't trust the stability of the Chinese yuan. So they want to keep their money in United States dollars, but more importantly, they want to keep it in real estate because they believe that the asset itself will appreciate. But they don't want to rent out to tenants because they don't want the property to be like ruined, you know? They want to hold on to these properties for 10 plus years, then move their family into it whenever they have their green cards.
And real estate ownership has been a very important cultural significance to the Chinese people.
Real estate to Chinese people signifies wealth, so a lot of Chinese people love buying real estate, myself included.
Families use real estate as a way to plan for their retirement. Guys with real estate are considered attractive choices for marriage, and the amount of real estate you own is directly related to your social status in society. Considering all this, you can see why real estate prices have continued rising over time. There's a high demand for real estate because of all these factors. And coupled with incredible price rises in the past, you can see why everyone and their mother wants to buy a home.
And surprisingly, real estate in China, I think on a per square foot basis, is more expensive than what we can get here in the United States. So that's pretty interesting to me. You can spend $1 or $2 million in US dollars for a small condo, or spend the same amount of money and buy a property, like a whole single family property with a whole backyard and a lot for the same price. So for them, it's really worth it.
Kind of reminds me of the 2008 US housing market, where everyone wants to buy real estate because real estate prices are only going up. The rush to buy houses was so huge that the developers were selling out complexes before even breaking ground for construction. However, even after construction finished, apartments just sat there empty because they had owners but no habitants. Demand was high because everyone wants to buy their second or third home to get rich on the real estate boom, so supply increased drastically to match the demand. But a lot of these homes were just sitting empty, as owners were only buying these homes in hopes of price appreciation. Because other asset sectors weren't as accessible and developed, real estate was the only thing people invested in. Based on one data set, Chinese families had around 70% of their wealth in real estate. Yes, you heard that right, 70%. They're not much for diversification.
I'm not surprised. But to be fair, for the past 20 years or so, Chinese real estate was pretty good. Like I had a friend whose family bought a property for around $70,000 and now it's worth around $2 million. So for them, it was a really good investment.
The collapse of Chinese property giant Evergrande unfolds. Shares in the highly indebted company have fallen 80% this year. And
15 towers unfinished for 7 years. The developer...
That's an amazing shot though. Like I would be so happy to be the cameraman filming this and seeing all these towers just go down at once. It's pretty awesome.
Bankrupt. These towers were recently brought down in Shanghai after 20 years of stalled construction.
Can you imagine having development for 20 years? That's pretty insane. Dang, look at that.
Evergrande took full advantage of this boom in China's real estate market and became one of the largest developers in the country. At one point in 2018, they were actually the biggest real estate company in Asia. When people look at something that big, well, they kind of just assume it's all legitimate. Oftentimes, though, that's not really the case.
It's too big to fail.
I hope you guys learned that lesson after the 2008 crisis. If anyone had looked under the hood, they would have realized that some of the practices happening at Evergrande were far from appropriate.
I feel like a lot of the larger developers have similar issues that Evergrande had, where they just get too big and they don't have operations right. Supply chain starts to fail. They have issues with their creditors. They can't deliver their units on time, etc., etc.
Now, due to the sheer scale of the company, a lot of practices were quite complicated, but here's my attempt at trying to simplify this. Remember earlier how I mentioned that FOMO into real estate was so bad that people were buying houses before construction even began? Usually a company like Evergrande would lease a piece of land from the local government, then they would turn around and sell the houses that are supposed to be built there and receive full payment for the houses before even breaking ground. Companies would never have any issue selling out as the demand for real estate was so high. People were more than happy to take out mortgages and buy houses just in hopes of owning real estate someday in the future. Now, the big problem that starts here is that companies like Evergrande wouldn't usually use the money from the sale to start construction. No, instead they would use the money as down payment to buy even more land.
Robbing Peter to pay Paul.
So they can sell even more apartments for the future. Now, this is already a huge problem. This should not have been allowed in the first place.
Actually, I think in the United States, you can't even do that, right? Like in the US, when you buy a new construction townhome or single family house, usually you put a down payment or a deposit. And as a property is being constructed, you kind of bought in at a certain price. So you're contractually obliged to pay for that property at a certain price, but you don't actually pay the full price and get a mortgage on it until the property is actually completed and you can move in. So this actually happened to some of my friends where they're buying a new construction property and it would take 6 months or so to complete construction. So they got locked in at a pretty pretty good price. Over time, the market did increase, so they were still good, but their mortgage hadn't closed yet, right? Their mortgage was at a floating rate because you can't lock in a rate until you're actually going to buy the property. So what happened was over the past few months, interest rates have increased significantly. So now their mortgage is at a way higher price than when they were initially quoted 6 months ago. So it's either bite the bullet and buy the property at the lower price but with a higher mortgage, or just let everything go. They'll say, you know what, I'm gonna cancel the contract. You can have my small deposit, and we'll just call it even Stevens. But again, for those companies, you don't get paid until after the properties are actually completed. Whereas I guess in this case, they get paid in full before the properties are even completed, which is insane.
Any unbiased person can look at the system and figure out that this isn't gonna last. This is exactly the job of the CCP, but they passed on this responsibility to the local governments. And this is where another problem lies. Local governments were directly benefiting from these real estate pyramid schemes that companies like Evergrande had going on. You see, in China, one of the big ways local governments make money is by leasing land to developers.
So in China, it's a little bit different. You don't actually own the land. China always owns the lands. China can give you a 99-year lease, so you can own the land as a tenant for 99 years, and then every 100 years or so, you can reapply to get the land again. But I think the reason why they do it is that they always have control over the land. So if they ever want to build like a new superhighway, or if they ever want to build a hospital, they don't have to ask you for permission. They just do it. Whereas like in the Bay Area, there's a lot of people called NIMBYers, right? NIMBUI, not in my backyard. And these people say, no, I don't want this Caltrain or BART to go through my neighborhood. And they prevent a lot of things from getting developed. Again, versus China, who just does things whenever they want to.
This is a prime example of perverse incentives. We don't even need to get into the corruption that goes on around these land leases. This was one of the main reasons why China's real estate bubble has gotten so big. Regulators were always slow to step in because it was directly benefiting them. The CCP saw where things were heading and tried to get things under control by implementing the 3 red line policies for property developers. But it was a little too late.
The debt burden continues to weigh on China's Evergrande Group as its angry suppliers are protesting the developers' unpaid bills while its bondholders' patience has dissipated.
So because they use the money from the sale of one property to buy more land, they eventually will run out of money to pay for the suppliers and the construction to complete each project.
The shady practices don't just stop there either. Evergrande would list these houses as assets under their balance sheet to get more loans from the banks so they can finish construction. These houses were already sold to other people, so no matter what accounting magic you use, these can't be considered assets of Evergrande.
Because they already paid in full, so they have the cash in their balance sheet, and the properties have already been sold to someone else. So it's using those properties they've already sold as part of their assets. So they're kind of like double counting the numbers here.
The worst part is that Evergrande wasn't the only one pulling these shady tricks. Almost every real estate company in China was operating this way. The whole sector was over-leveraged to the teeth. Just like a Ponzi scheme, the only way to continue forever is if you continue growing forever. But you can't keep growing if people lose trust in Evergrande's ability to stay solvent. And I'm sure you guessed it by now, that's exactly what happened. Once the company misses one payment, chaos ensues. Early last year, one of Evergrande's subsidiary companies failed to make a payment on its loans, and people started looking deeper into its financials.
This was a huge issue last year. Honestly, I'd never even heard of the company Evergrande until these issues happened last year, and then it was all over the news.
This is when the house of cards started crumbling, and the news about contagions spread across the world.
The debt burden continues to weigh on China's Evergrande Group.
China's top real estate developer, Evergrande, is reeling under a financial crunch.
I guess another thing that I didn't realize here is that because they're buying their properties in full from day one before the properties are even completed, that means they're paying a mortgage on a property that doesn't even exist. That's why they don't want to pay their mortgage anymore. It's pretty insane.
While in China, the debt crisis at Evergrande is only snowballing.
And there's so many questions surrounding Evergrande.
In a notice circulating on social media, the suppliers have demanded payment from Evergrande.
Evergrande.
And because Evergrande is like a huge part of China's economy, when that thing goes down, it will affect the rest of China's economy.
These investors were lured in with various promises
to demand the developer to give them their money back. The protests made authorities nervous.
When the news got out that Evergrande could default on $300 billion worth of loans, panic spread throughout the economy. People also realized that this problem isn't limited to Evergrande. The whole real estate sector is over-leveraged, and it's starting to crumble. Chinese developers owed around $5.3 trillion in debt. When the CCP realized just how big the problem was, they decided to step in and soften the blow back in 2021. Ever since then, Evergrande and other real estate developers have been chugging along slowly with the help of the CCP. Construction of buildings sold in 2019 are still not done. All the funds from new sales are basically going towards paying off companies' liabilities instead of actually finishing up projects. This is just one example of unfinished projects that had to be demolished because of problems from the delay in construction.
So what happens to all the money for all those units that were already bought for? Did these people just not get their units anymore? I have no idea what's going on here.
Whenever owners of these houses would ask about construction delays, they were just met with excuse after excuse. Slowly, things just got to be too much. Some of these citizens had their whole life savings invested in these unfinished projects, and they just couldn't take it anymore.
It's wild.
So, on July 1st, all of the home buyers from a project in central China.
So this is why when you buy real estate, you need to make sure the numbers make sense from day one. Personally, I don't like buying speculative real estate, like, buying a property and expecting it to just magically appreciate in value and then sell it. Then we buy cash flowing rental properties. So when we buy them, they're already rent ready, or it needs a minor rehab that we can take care of. We put a tenant inside, and the tenant's rent can cover all of our expenses, like the mortgage, the insurance, the taxes, and we're net positive. So these things don't happen to us.
Saying that they would stop paying their mortgage payments to the bank unless the construction restarts. Now, a project usually includes thousands of houses and are worth upwards of hundreds of millions of dollars. But at the end of the day, it was just one project in a nation of 1.6 billion people, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But it didn't stop at just that one project. By the same evening, home buyers from another such project had announced the same mortgage boycott, and the movement started to spread across the nation. By July 12th, 100 projects had joined the boycott. And as of the writing of this script, over 300 projects across China are boycotting mortgage payments until construction resumes. Tens of thousands of people have willingly defaulted on their mortgages in hopes of getting the government's attention. People have also taken to the street to protest these construction delays. Currently, these 300 projects represent more than $100 billion of debt.
I feel bad for the banks though, because they did the mortgage, but they're not the ones who are delaying the projects, right? It's the developers who are the ones who aren't doing their job.
That China's big banks are holding. When you factor in that some major developers also defaulted last year on their debt, this is not a good sign for China's banking institutions. What's even more concerning for banks and the government is not just $100 billion in possible default, but the growing number of people who are joining in on the boycott. The CCP has already ordered banks and news organizations to stop publishing reports about mortgage boycotts. Party officials are doing everything they can to kill this news. These boycotts represent an existential crisis for Chinese banks. A crisis that has a potential to be 100 times worse than what American banks faced in 2008.
See, it's a lot harder to censor news nowadays because everyone has their own WeChat groups. If some person in one part of China says something, they can easily transmit that information to their family members or friends across the other side of the country. Because before, all you have to do is block the major TV networks and newspaper articles.
One of the big differences between 2008 and the current situation in China is that the majority of these loans are collateralized by houses that are not yet built. So banks can't just repossess the house when someone defaults and cuts their losses.
So the banks have to become enemies with the developers as well. I don't know how they're going to do it.
Banks are being forced to eat these losses, and if the defaults keep growing, there's a chance that big banks might fold. One of the big 4 state banks in China has already limited people's withdrawals. I'm sure most of you already know how the modern banking system works, but here's a quick overview for everyone else. Banks usually loan the money that depositors deposit and hope to earn interest on it to make a profit. Usually the reserve requirement is set by the central banks. Let's say that it's 10%. That means that whenever banks get $100 in deposits, they are only required to keep $10 in the vault, and they can loan out $90 and charge interest on it. So this is just a very simplified example, but These types of transactions happen millions of times over and over again in an economy, and that's basically how the modern banking system works.
To add another layer to that, most banks who originate loans then sell those loans to another party to get their money back, and then these are made to cycle over and over and over again, and they continue making more loans and making more money, etc., etc.
For every $100 in deposits, banks are able to create about $1,000 of money in circulation. Now, this system is pretty great. In the past century, a lot of economic growth is in part thanks to this fractional reserve banking. But the only way this system works is if depositors have trust in the bank's ability to keep their money safe.
To prevent runs from the bank, the FDIC started insuring bank accounts up to $250,000. So if you have money in a major bank like Chase or Wells Fargo, and for some reason those companies happen to go under and no bank buys them out, your money up to $250K is technically insured, and the federal government will pay you back eventually.
Now, if too many of these loans that banks are giving out become worthless, then that trust starts to erode. This is why the USA enacted strict lending regulations after the 2008 crisis, so banks are careful with who they lend to. Now, as more and more homebuyers are defaulting on their loans, Chinese banks are also at risk of losing the trust of the depositors. Putting limits on the withdrawals definitely does not help with building that trust. If too many people start pulling out their deposits from the banks, then a bank run happens and banks collapse because of it. This is where the big headache lies for the CCP. The Chinese economy is heavily reliant on its financial sector and the real estate sector. Real estate represents around 30% of China's GDP, while 7 out of the top 10 companies in China are financial institutions. This is why, as the news about these boycotts spread, the CCP held an emergency meeting with the banks to discuss the rising risk of these defaults. To help the struggling developers, the CCP is considering injecting more than $1 trillion into real estate companies so that they can finish off construction with these projects. Remember last year when the Evergrande news came out? The CCP was strictly against bailing out failing companies as they didn't want to promote risky business behavior in China. But now that they're realizing that this has the potential to tank the government, CCP officials are changing their tone when it comes to bailouts.
Too big to fail.
The CCP has also stepped up the censoring around this topic.
Which is pretty funny, right? Like if you're a poor person and you somehow default on credit cards or your car payments, yeah, they don't care. They'll take away your house, take away your car, and they'll ruin your credit score and you're left in the dirt. But if you are a big conglomerate, you make a lot of money, you have a lot of jobs, you're a huge part of the economy, they will do everything in their power to make sure that you're taken care of and will give you money to make sure you are successful. It must be nice. So that was a lot of great information, and I was surprised to see all of this going on. Honestly, I think the biggest issue was that they allowed the sale of properties at full price before the properties were completed with construction. That is not how we do it here in the United States, as far as I know. You're only allowed to buy the property in full and get a mortgage on it after the property is completed and it's move-in ready. So this way, your developers aren't able to just take that money and use it on other projects. Instead, the deposit is more of a security blanket, so developers know that these units are already spoken for and they don't have to worry about marketing it too hard. So it looks like China's in a really big mess. I'm surprised to see how everything shakes out and how China's problems will cause issues here in the United States. I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts on what's going to happen in the future. And if you're curious to see how the Bay Area real estate market is going, check out this video over here where I go over all the details and statistics. Thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time. Take care.